Have you ever wondered why we eat little silhouettes of people and build little houses made of bread infused with ginger? Well, I certainly have, so today join me as we delve through the fascinating and obscure history behind gingerbread, gingerbread men, and gingerbread houses just in time for the holiday season. But first, remember that if you subscribe and comment a suggestion for the topic of my next history video, I'll be very likely to use your suggestion because starting today, I'm going to be randomly selecting one of the comments under my videos to decide the topic of the next one. Given that not many of you comment at the moment, there's a very, very good chance that whoever actually does will get their comment chosen. So just a heads up. Now onto the history behind gingerbread. Some claim that the ancient Egyptians, my favorite ancient civilization by far, which I have a whole other channel about, created gingerbread. I wish that were the case, but they, along with the Greco-Roman world, just had honey cakes and spiced honey bread, which I guess is sorta like gingerbread, but it's not the real deal, so we're gonna bypass that. Now, ginger, native to Southeast Asia, was first cultivated in China, and they actually did that early enough for it to reach the early Roman Empire. And they consumed ginger as both food and medicine in both nations. Well, if you can call them nations. But it wouldn't be until the 10th century that the first Chinese recipes for making gingerbread would appear, and they were also consumed as both food and medicine. But gingerbread wouldn't have morphed into its current form without getting to Europe. Gingerbread was first brought to medieval Europe by a late 10th century Eastern Christian Armenian monk named Gregory of Nicopolis, who somehow ended up living as a hermit outside the small town of Pithiviers in France. And he reportedly brought gingerbread with him from Byzantium. But he was just one man, so he wasn't able to supply the whole continent with the stuff, only his guests. But gingerbread did come to the continent for good when Crusaders brought gingerbread back from the Levant in the late 11th century after the First Crusade had kicked off, along with various spices like pepper, cinnamon, and, of course, ginger itself. So now that this little delectable treat had entered Europe, how did those good old Euros use them? Well, the answer is probably stranger than you'd think. First of all, European gingerbread initially consisted of ground almonds, stale breadcrumbs, rosewater, sugar, and ginger. Monks were some of the first to use gingerbread. They offered sheets of the stuff and Eucharist wafers topped with a paste infused with ginger to the sick and injured being cared for by them, and they also seem to have put gingerbread through molds in the shapes of saints and religious iconography in order to act as religious instruction. These elaborate pieces of gingerbread were also customarily distributed on the feast days of particular saints, and pilgrims took them back from pilgrimage sites as souvenirs. Since there was no refrigeration at the time, and gingerbread sorta smells good, another use of gingerbread was crumbling it onto rotting meat in order to mask its revolting smell. I don't know if it was really able to mask its flavor, though. Gingerbread was also shaped into edible art, as it is today, but the molds used then were rather intricate. These early European gingerbread cookies were made to look like such things as animals, kings, and queens, and became a staple at medieval fairs in Low Countries, Germany, England, and France, leading to the cookies sold at fairs becoming known as fairings, of all things. I know, not very creative. These cookies were also commonly shaped like flowers in spring and like birds in autumn, in addition to saints during town fairs honoring their patron saints, and more Christian iconography, of course. But gingerbread also appears to have been viewed as something a bit more than just a sweet treat. Eating pieces of gingerbread shaped like different things was supposed to help you in your love life, of all things. Apparently, eating heart-shaped pieces of gingerbread was meant to both ward off evil and help you find lovers. Eating rabbit-shaped gingerbread was supposed to enhance your fertility, and eating pieces of gingerbread in the shape of a man with a lion's head was meant to bestow virility on you, and so on and so on. Young unmarried women even gobbled up man-shaped gingerbread figures representing their future husband in the hopes of attracting one, which, unfortunately, probably wouldn't work today. In addition, eating letters in gingerbread was also meant to boost intelligence as early as the 14th century. In at least one instance, gingerbread was also used in order to boost a ruler's popularity with his subjects when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, who reigned from 1452 to 1493, distributed 4,000 pieces of gingerbread stamped with portraits of himself to his subjects. Let's hope that worked. Noble ladies also reportedly showed favor to certain knights prior to tournaments and battles by giving them gingerbread, and important news was sometimes reportedly disseminated through slabs of gingerbread. This included when two noble houses were joined in marriage, when the combined coat of arms was stamped onto pieces of gingerbread. As a result of all these different ways of putting gingerbread to good use, gingerbread making became its own profession, and non-professionals were actually barred from creating it in what's now modern Germany and France, although such rules were lifted around Xmas and Easter. As such, gingerbread making guilds were established in various German cities like Nuremberg, Ulm, Polsnitz, at Torun in Poland, at Tula in Russia, at Pest in Hungary, at Pardubice in Prague in what's now the Czech Republic, and at Lyon in France. These cities shared in common the fact that they sat along trade routes, which was a necessity because of how expensive and hard to find ginger was at the time. As a testament to their gingerbread making heritage, the most tasty form of heritage, I suppose, museums in Torun and Ulm exhibit substantial antique gingerbread mold collections, so next time you're in those two cities, check them out, I guess. Oh, and also Nuremberg, which was famous for its gingerbread as early as the 14th century, had the added bonus of having access to dense forests filled with honey-producing beehives, which of course was the sweetener of gingerbread back then. The town's master bakers and artisans created truly ornate pieces of gingerbread art, which were sometimes covered with gold flakes and they even produced pieces the size of a small child, which is pretty impressive. Gingerbread was also further developed in Franconian convents by nuns making their desserts, and in the 15th century the nuns of Waltz Abbey in Sweden were baking gingerbread in order to cure their indigestion. This use for gingerbread is also attested to in England, where in the 16th century English writer John Barrett wrote that in his time gingerbread was a kind of cake or paste made to comfort the stomach, which is how he spelled stomach. So far, gingerbread men and gingerbread houses haven't really made an appearance yet, as I'm sure you've noticed, but now they will. The first gingerbread men could arguably have been the creation of England's Queen Elizabeth I, who, having handy her own gingerbread baker, gifted courtiers and visiting dignitaries caricatures of them in gingerbread, in order to demonstrate that they had earned her favor. Although I suppose we could count those medieval gingerbread husbands as the first gingerbread men, this, surprisingly, isn't the view taken by most of my sources. Now, Queen Elizabeth commissioned a gingerbread likeness of at least one specific individual, one of her admirers, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Robert Dudley's elaborate costumes were painstakingly copied down to the most minute details in his gingerbread effigy. During Elizabeth I's reign, gingerbread had also become popular enough to warrant a reference to it in a Shakespeare play published in 1598, Love's Labour's Lost, in which the character Costard says, "And I had but 1 penny in the world, thou shouldst have it to buy gingerbread." Maybe this all has to do with the fact that in 16th century England, the stale breadcrumbs usually made to create gingerbread before was replaced with flour, which I imagine must have tasted a tad better. But due to its magical connotations and an increase in superstition, gingerbread sort of became taboo for a while after the end of the 16th century. You see, witches were said to use them as proto-voodoo dolls by eating pieces shaped like people, killing the people represented. In addition, it was heavily associated with Catholic festivities, which Protestant domains of the time were not too keen on. In 1607, the city of Delft in the Netherlands just outright banned baking or eating it, and the word gingerbread even turned into an insult, meaning ineffectual or cowardly. However, a gingerbread slab with letters incised into it was also sometimes used to teach children the alphabet in the form of something called a horn book. an otherwise wooden slab that was used to teach children the alphabet, various prayers, etc. And the reason they used gingerbread instead of wood was because it was less expensive at this point, and children could eat the letters they successfully learned, which is a pretty tasty perk, eh? This is attested to by a poem of one Matthew Prior, a late 17th and early 18th century English poet and politician, in which one of the lines is, "A hornbook gives of gingerbread." In America, the cane sugar that was now being used to make gingerbread was substituted with molasses, and that is what resulted in the main form of gingerbread where I'm from. Apparently, this molasses is why gingerbread men are so stubby nowadays somehow. Now, fast forwarding to the late 18th century, a peculiar example of molasses-infused gingerbread was made when George Washington's mother, Mary Ball Washington, baked a molasses-infused and orange-flavored gingerbread cake for who else but the Marquis de Lafayette when he came to visit her near the end of her life. A derivation of this is still called Lafayette gingerbread. With the early 19th century comes the advent of the gingerbread house, although that may not actually be true. You see, when delving into the history behind gingerbread houses, one comes across a truly enormous, fiery debate. Did the existence of the fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, published by the Brothers Grimm in 1812, inspire the creation of the gingerbread house, or did the gingerbread house's prior existence inspire Hansel and Gretel? Well, who knows? Just for reference, the gingerbread house is where the witch in Hansel and Gretel lives, the place where she tries to eat them. I choose to believe the version where the gingerbread house is a derivation of the one in Hansel and Gretel, and that's what inspired German bakeries to begin producing gingerbread houses. In addition, it inspired them to make finely molded gingerbread cookies again, and oddly enough, Xmas cards made out of gingerbread. Tinsmiths also started coming out with all sorts of cookie cutters for gingerbread, which came in handy during the holidays since cookies were still being hung on Xmas trees at the time. Most such cookies were half an inch thick and were either of animals or gingerbread men. And although gingerbread houses may not have preceded Hansel and Gretel, its inclusion in the tale may very well have been a result of its association with witches back during the Middle Ages and the Reformation. Early German gingerbread houses were made of that gingerbread substance called Lebkuchen, which, although having ginger, was also extra spicy. As a result, their original name was Lebkuchenhausen. Really rolls off the tongue, eh? Like in the good old days, professional artists and craftsmen were hard to add to them too, apparently. And the reason those gingerbread/Lebkuchen houses made it to North America is because they were spread to the States by German immigrants coming there. Otherwise, that's pretty much the history of gingerbread houses, surprisingly enough. So now, given that I've become obsessed with gingerbread as a result of making this video, I've decided that I'm going to answer some absurd questions related to gingerbread, which I know must have popped up in the back of your minds at some point because they did in mine. These two questions are: what's the biggest gingerbread house ever made? And what's the biggest gingerbread man of all time? Well, I have an answer to both, because after all, it's just recent gingerbread history, right? This mind-numbingly massive gingerbread construction was, get this, 35.8 million calories, covered 2,520 square foot, and was 10.1 feet tall at its tallest point. It was created in Bryan, Texas, a town 90 miles northwest of Houston, by something called the Traditions Club on a plot of land near their clubhouse in order to raise funds for a then-new trauma center at St. Joseph's Hospital nearby in November of 2013. They did so by offering visitors the chance to meet Santa Claus in exchange for a donation to the hospital, usually just $2 to $3. But I bet it sure added up because they were visited by an extraordinary 1,000 people on average per night. The previous record holder it beat was another American gingerbread house, this time one made in the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota the previous year. Bryan, Texas's gingerbread house wasn't completely made out of gingerbread though. It did have a wooden frame under its edible exterior. But still, it took nearly 4,000 12 times 17 8-inch gingerbread bricks and almost 22,000 pieces of candy, all donated by the local community to build it, which is still pretty impressive. In fact, it was so large that they actually had to get permits for it from the city of Bryan. Now, the largest gingerbread man was 1,435 pounds and 3 ounces, or 651 kilograms, and it was created by an IKEA branch in Oslo, Norway, oddly enough. It was also baked in one piece. This gingerbread giant was unveiled in November of 2009 by, believe it or not, the world's tallest man, Sultan Kosen. The previous record holder was a gingerbread man from Texas, ironically enough, so maybe gingerbread world records are cyclical, and Norway's about to create the biggest gingerbread house. I know it's a bit of a far-fetched theory, but you never know. Anyways, thank you so much for delving into gingerbread's surprisingly deep and bizarre history with me, and remember to subscribe and comment if you want your suggestion to be the basis of my next video. Goodbye.